Hello, everyone. This is Annie Cartwright. I'm an attorney in Husch Blackwell's Healthcare, Life Sciences, and Education Group. We're excited to give today's presentation on the risks of expert educators, researchers, and healthcare providers becoming export violators. Before we begin, I will cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are application icons for use during today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We'll try our best to answer questions during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, we'll do our best to respond later by email. We really do appreciate audience participation and encourage you to submit your questions. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help icon, which provides information on common technical issues. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the Resource List icon, which looks like a folder. This program has been approved for continuing legal education credit in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas, with Colorado and Wisconsin credit pending. To report your hours in Illinois, Indiana, Nebraska, Tennessee, or Texas, click on the CLE widget at the bottom of your screen and complete the questions. A recording of the webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing for about 2 weeks once it's available. A link will be mailed to you with the recording link along with a certificate of attendance. Again, I'm Annie Cartwright. I work with institutions involved in academic medicine and other education, including areas tied to federal funding, which we'll touch on very briefly at the end of today's presentation with regard to foreign source reporting. But our featured speaker today is Grant Leach. Grant focuses his practice on international trade, export controls, trade sanctions, and anti-corruption compliance, issues which, as we will learn today, touch on the operations of institutions involved in academic medicine, healthcare, and education. Grant has extensive experience helping clients navigate complex issues related to international commerce and associated compliance challenges. And with that, I will hand it over to Grant to explain when expert educators can become export violators.
And thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you all for joining us. As you've probably seen in the news, this idea of on-campus export compliance is becoming a very high enforcement priority for the federal government. What I'm going to try and provide here is a very high-level overview of these different export compliance obligations. Some of you might be at a university where you have a whole team of export compliance professionals. It might seem like I am oversimplifying a lot of these concepts. If that's the case, please bear with me, because we also have a lot of people on this call who might be responsible for wearing 7 or 8 different compliance hats at their institution, and export compliance might just be one of those hats. So if you're in that boat, please try not to get discouraged. I know that these are some very complicated concepts. I'm going to try and get through them as efficiently as I can in the hour that we have. One thing here to keep in mind with all of these regulations is that they are very, very fact-specific. Whatever your compliance outcome is will depend heavily on the type of technology you're dealing with, the circumstances in which you're using it, and the nationalities of the faculty or students involved. If you change any one of those facts, you can get a completely different outcome. So just be aware that I'm trying to give you some meat and some substance here, but there's also just so many very different facts that can affect how these regulations apply to you. This next slide, when we talk about export risks for an academic institution, the first is actual exports of physical items. If you're dealing with some sort of hardware or device that is subject to export restrictions, you can violate these laws if your faculty or students take a prototype, take an actual device outside of the United States with them during their travels. The second category is exports of technical data outside the U.S. We're going to cover all kinds of different types of design drawings, other technology that is subject to export controls. This isn't the kind of stuff that you can pack up in a suitcase, but it is the kind of stuff that you can put in an email and forward that email outside the U.S., that's an export. If you load that type of technical data onto a laptop or smartphone and carry that laptop or smartphone with you outside the U.S., that can be an export. If you put these files on a server, if that server is located in the U.S., but then you grant people outside the U.S. access to that server, depending on the facts and circumstances, that can be an export. And then also, if you have faculty or students from your institution who are giving presentations outside the U.S., depending on how that presentation or that conference is run, that can be an export. And then last but not least is this third category, which is called a deemed export. This is if you have foreign faculty or students who are in the U.S. on your campus, and if you share sensitive data with them, either by making research available to them, in some instances just giving them a visual disclosure or explaining things to them verbally, that is what's called a deemed export. A deemed export won't always require a license, but it will sometimes. In this picture, I found a little brain with feet. This is the risk that the U.S. government is worried about, this idea that we will give visitors to our country very sensitive technical data, and then they will leave, return to their home countries, and take that data with them, which presents as much risk as putting the file in an email and emailing it straight to their country. There are consequences for failure to comply with these rules and regulations. Up here in the right-hand corner, this is actually a picture taken from a disassembled Iranian missile. Iran, we found one of their missiles, took it apart, and we're very surprised to see that it had U.S. origin electronic components inside of it. The biggest risk here for failure to comply with these regulations is that foreign adversaries will take our own technology and use it against our own military. Another major list here is just the loss in intellectual property. BIS, for one, estimates that we lose over $1 billion worth of IP theft every year just through export violations of all these different deemed export requirements. And finally, there's also monetary penalties and jail times. You have criminal penalties of up to $1 million per violation, civil penalties equal to the greater of $300,000 per violation, or 2 times the transaction value, and then also jail time, up to 20 years. There's also some major operational difficulties you might encounter. The worst is a nightmare scenario. Let's say your university finds someone who is truly the world's leader in their area of expertise. You convince this person to move to the U.S. to relocate their entire family, and then their very first day on the job, you find out that because of their nationality, they can't perform the research you want them to perform because you don't have the right export license. You can avoid those embarrassing problems by being proactive, by looking at these things on the front end. Another problem is graduation delays. If you have foreign students who have to perform specialty research in order to obtain their degrees, if you don't have the appropriate licenses, they're not going to be able to perform that research and get the degree they want. And then finally, we'll cover a lot of different federal funding programs impose export compliance obligations. And if your organization doesn't have an adequate compliance program, you're not going to be able to comply with these funding restrictions and compete for those funding sources. The first set of regulations that we're going to go over is the ITAR regulations. That stands for International Traffic in Arms, and those regulations cover military goods and technology. They're administered by the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, which is under the Department of State umbrella. The ITAR regulations start with the U.S. munitions list. There's over 20 different categories on this list, but it covers all kinds of things like firearms, ground vehicles, military aircraft, And I know we have a lot of medical institutions on the call today. Down here in the bottom right-hand column is toxicological agents and biological agents. If these have been purposed for military use, they are on the USML and subject to all of these ITAR regulations. You have defense articles. That's any tangible item listed on the USML, but that also includes components, parts, and accessories for those items. So it's not just building a tank. It could be building the turret or some of the steering mechanisms that help to control that tank. You have technical data. That is a subset of defense articles. It basically includes any design drawings, other information for the production, manufacture, assembly, or use of a defense article. We'll cover the EAR regulations later, but a major difference between the ITAR regulations and the EAR regulations is that if you're dealing with a military good, then any technical data related to that good is subject to the ITAR's export restrictions. We'll cover the EAR restrictions later. Those will vary from good to good, from nationality to nationality. But in the ITAR, when they talk about imposing export restrictions on technical data, that applies to all kinds of technical data associated with that military good. And then last, another category that captures these is defense services. The ITAR also regulates defense services, and if you share any of that regulated technical data with a foreign person, that is a defense service, and those defense services are also regulated by the ITAR regulations. So the first step in dealing with these ITAR regulations is figuring out whether or not the items or technology you're dealing with are on or off of this USML. That's called an ITAR classification. You always have the option to self-classify your items. If your items are in one of those gray areas and you're not sure whether or not they meet the criteria for inclusion on the USML, you can apply to DDTC and obtain a commodity jurisdiction. That's just an official letter from them on their letterhead that will tell you exactly what category they think your item is in. And here, this last bullet point, if you do determine that your item is not on the USML, meaning it's not subject to the ITAR, there's still a possibility that that item could be subject to the EAR, which are less restrictive than the ITAR, but still impose very serious compliance obligations. ITAR registration, a unique thing about the ITAR regulations is if you're engaged in manufacturing defense articles or providing defense services, it's mandatory that you must register with the DDTC. That registration obligation is a requirement even if you're doing all of that on a purely domestic basis, not exporting any information, not dealing with any foreign persons or any deemed exports. That's a mandatory registration obligation. There is a limited exception if you're only doing all that ITAR stuff within an experimental or scientific context. But even if you manage to avoid the registration obligation, you still have to comply with all the ITAR's export prohibitions. So if you have foreign employees, faculty, student in your organization, even if you don't have to register with ITAR, you still have to comply with all of these deemed export prohibitions. So exporting under ITAR, it takes the default position that any export of defense items or technical data is prohibited. ITAR does have some exceptions, but those exceptions are very limited, and it also prohibits any exports to any foreign destination. It doesn't make the same sort of distinctions between destinations and nationalities that the EAR regulations make. It's just a blanket prohibition. If you're dealing with something that's subject to the ITAR regulations, you should just assume that you can't export it without a license. And then the ITAR also prohibits deemed exports, and a big difference between the ITAR regulations and the EAR regulations is that the ITAR regulations presume that anything you export to a foreign person has been exported to any country in which they've ever held a citizenship or a permanent residency. So if you've become an Iranian citizen at some point in your life, in the eyes of the ITAR regulations, you can never live that down. It stays with you like getting sprayed by a skunk. You're just considered to permanently have that Iranian citizenship status. So that's very important with the ITAR regulations, is knowing not just what current citizen status your faculty and students have, but what previous citizenship status they've also held. The ITAR provides a couple of exceptions. One here is a public domain exception. That means if you're dealing with information that is either published or intended to be published, it's exempt from these ITAR regulations. However, if you accept any sort of publication restrictions, then you're generally disqualified from this publication exception. So it's very important that you know exactly what sort of restrictions your funding partners are imposing on you. And it's also important if you're accepting government funding, if that government funding comes with any access or dissemination restrictions or imposes additional export control requirements, that will also disqualify you from this public domain exception. The ITAR makes another exception for bona fide and full-time regular employees. What this means is if you have someone who is a full-time employee of your university, their permanent abode during their entire period of employment is in the U.S. They cannot be a national of any of these prohibited countries, and also you have to inform them in writing of these ITAR compliance obligations and that they are prohibited from exporting this equipment. So in order to actually use this exception, there is a requirement that you have to make this written notification. A lot of universities mess up on that requirement, not just universities, but a lot of industry practitioners generally. So that brings us to our first poll question. Which one of the following university employees is eligible to receive ITAR technical data under the ITAR bona fide and full-time regular employee exception? Is it an employee who is currently a citizen of Iran? Is it an employee who is formerly a citizen of Iran but has recently become a Canadian citizen? Is it both employee A and employee B, or is it none of the above? So I'll give you all about 30 seconds to select your answer.
It looks like we have a pretty good response rate going here, but we did have one question come in, which is whether a permanent resident has export control restrictions. And if I've understood you correctly so far, Grant, I think in some cases they may. Is that right?
Yeah. And again, this stuff all gets very technical, and it involves a horrible Venn diagram with immigration law and export law. But just being a permanent resident in the U.S. is not enough if you have one of those former citizenships, and there's a whole process for how you may or may not renounce citizenship. But basically, we're here at the results. The correct answer here is D. The idea is, the most conservative approach anyways, is if you have faculty or students who have at any time been an Iranian citizen, even if they've now established permanent residence in the U.S., have no intention to ever return to Iran, you should treat them as remaining an Iranian citizen for ITAR licensing purposes. And we'll cover, when we talk about the EAR regulations there, you can lose your Iranian citizenship. The EAR regulations look at your most recently acquired citizenship, but ITAR, and I don't mean to keep bagging on Iran. It could be China, it could be Uruguay. For ITAR, they consider you to always retain any citizenships you've held during your life. So with that said, that brings us to the Export Administration Regulations. These are much more flexible than the ITAR regulations. They cover a much broader category of goods and technology, but they also make a lot of different exceptions, so you have some wiggle room where you might not require a license sometimes, depending on what sort of technology you're dealing with, or depending on the nationality of who you might be sharing it with. Key federal agency that's in charge of enforcing the EAR is the Bureau of Industry and Security, that's BIS. They fall under the umbrella of the Department of Commerce. There are 10 categories of goods that show up on the Commerce Control List. That is the list of every single item that is subject to these different EAR licensing requirements. Category 0 counts as a category. That's why if you read the numbers, it only says 9, but if you count them up, there's actually 10 categories. I'd mentioned before, under the ITAR regulations, the different toxic agents and biological weapons that were subject to the ITAR regulations when they've been appropriated for military use. A lot of that stuff, if you take it and have it just formulated for civil use, then it gets captured in this category 1 under materials, chemicals, and toxins. Another important category here is category 3, the electronics design, development, and production. Here in the U.S., we make the quickest and lightest electronic components, whether it's a circuit, a microprocessor. That's all the kind of stuff that is capable of steering a missile and is also light enough that it's not going to add any more weight than necessary. But that stuff also has a lot of valuable civil uses. So instead of regulating it exclusively in the ITAR, we've moved it here into the EAR, where it's subject to heavy export restrictions, but also available for civil export uses. And then another important category here is this category 5, telecommunications and information security. If you're dealing with encryption technology, encryption software, that can be subject to a lot of export restrictions. The EAR, it covers items. That's the default term that covers physical commodities as well as software and technology. And then the EAR applies to deemed exports of technology, which is the EAR equivalent of technical data under the ITAR. And here, the EAR does make a lot of exceptions. The EAR will sometimes not impose any restrictions on this technology. Sometimes it will only impose restrictions if the technology relates to development or production of a regulated item. And sometimes the most restrictive category is restrictions on technology related to the use of a controlled item. But that all varies from one item to the next. The EAR, this is to kind of talk about that distinction between export requirements that apply to physical items under the EAR and export requirements that apply to use technology. If you have personal protective equipment, such as hazmat suits, the kind of things you need to handle dangerous chemicals in a laboratory, if you were to pack that suit up in a box and ship it to China, that would require an export license. However, if you have a Chinese student on your campus, you can give them that same personal protective suit while they're in the U.S. That is not considered an export under the EAR. Also, it's important to note that there are some technology restrictions that would cover technology for developing or designing that kind of suit, but if it's technology that just relates to using that suit, trying to figure out how to put that suit on and how to safely use it, you can also share that associated technology with your foreign students. The EAR classification analysis is very similar to the ITAR classification analysis. The first step you have to do is figure out whether the item is on the U.S. munitions list, because the ITAR regulations preempt the EAR regulations. Once you've figured out whether or not it's on the ITAR list, you look at those 10 categories of the Commerce Control List. You look to see if it falls in any of those ECCN numbers. If it's not covered under an ECCN number, then it's what's considered EAR 99. So if your item is not on that list at all, it's EAR 99, which is generally free to export to any jurisdiction unless it's a prohibited country or a prohibited person. As I said, this export control analysis is very, very fact-specific, but it's also crucial, because if you classify your goods in the wrong category, then that determines all of the export restrictions that apply to those goods. And if you aren't dealing in the right category, then you're also probably ignoring all of the applicable restrictions. As with ITAR goods, you always have the option to self-classify, but BIS offers what's called a CCATS. That is an official classification of your good that BIS can provide to you. And the best approach here, if you'll please indulge me putting in a picture here of Macho Man and Hulk Hogan, is to form a tag team. These ECCN classifications are incredibly complicated. You need someone who understands the technical capabilities of your items, of your technology, to figure out sort of things like what its processing time is, what sort of alloys the material might be made from, how light or how heavy this stuff is. But you also need someone who understands the EAR, someone who can read the different exceptions that apply to these classifications. It took a team of engineers and attorneys to write this entire Commerce Control List, so it takes teams of engineers and attorneys working together to figure out how these regulations apply. This is just some public information that BIS puts out. If you're trying to figure, based on the total volume of deemed export license applications they receive, about 30% of those applications relate to technology controlled under 3E001, which has to do with all those very sensitive electronic components, circuit boards. Then about 35% of the applications they receive relates to encryption technology, but that only adds up to 65% of the applications. There's another 35% of applications they receive that cover the whole range of technology that's restricted under the EAR regulations. Theoretically, if you do know you have items or technology on campus that do fall under one of these ECCN classifications, the next step you have to do is look at the reasons for control. These classifications have a whole pile of abbreviations, and those different abbreviations will help you figure out which countries you can share those items or technology with, or which countries you first have to obtain a license. So you figure out the ECCN, then you figure out what the reasons for control are, then you go to this commerce country chart, and I've copied and pasted part of it at the bottom of this slide, figure out if there's an X in any of those columns, and depending on whether that column has an X, you'll need to obtain a license, or if there's no X in the column, that means you can proceed to share it with someone from that country. So it's different from the ITAR regulations. The ITAR regulations pretty much presume that exports will always require a license. The EAR regulations, on the other hand, give you some of this flexibility depending on what item you're working with and what the nationality is of the country or person you wish to share it with. Just to kind of talk through some of these examples, I've dug up a few different items. Now, the first one here is a teddy bear. If you take this teddy bear, you're not going to find it anywhere on the Commerce Control List. That means its category classification is EAR 99. As an EAR 99 item, this teddy bear does not have any associated technology restrictions. That means if you have design drawings for this teddy bear, if you have information for how to produce the teddy bear, how to wash the teddy bear, how to repair the teddy bear, that sort of information is completely exempt from ECCN export controls. It's basically the most neutral, harmless category you can find. The second example here is a horse. You might be interested to know this, but horses are actually listed on the Commerce Control List under ECCN 0A980. The export restrictions to a horse, they require a license if exported by sea, but otherwise, if you put the horse on a truck, if you put the horse on a plane, you don't need an export license. And then this category 0A980 does not include any associated technology controls. So if you have research on horse genetics, if you have research on veterinary techniques to care for a horse, that stuff is not captured under the ECCN, which means it's not subject to export controls. The horse itself might need a license if you're going to put it on a boat, but if you have foreign students and you want to share some of that horse research with them, that research itself is exempt from all of the licensing requirements. So that brings us to the next poll question. Under which circumstances does a horse require an export license? If it's exported by truck to Canada or Mexico, if it's exported by air to France, if it's exported by boat to India, or all of the above. Please select your answer and give you about 20 seconds to do so.
Grant, I'm assuming that teddy bear in your example was not a Teddy Ruxpin or something with highly technical interworkings like so many teddy bears today.
No, it was just stuffing and fuzz. That is a good point, though. When you have all these smart devices that have this background encryption that helps them connect to something in the cloud, that can capture those items and subject you to export controls. But if it's just a dumb teddy bear with none of that smart functionality, it's EAR 99.
Thank you.
So it looks like pretty much 85% of you got this right. The only instance where a horse requires an export license in those examples if it's on a boat to India. Luckily, no one thought it required a license on a truck to Canada or Mexico. Some of you thought it required a license to export it by air to France. To my knowledge, that's not the case. So that last example was a horse. The horse itself might need an export license, but technology associated with the horse did not. This next example is the goatpox virus in the goatpox vaccine. I strongly recommend, if you can avoid it, do not do a Google image search for goatpox. There was some really gross stuff out there. This diseased goat was about the least offensive picture I could find. As you can see, this is what happens when a goat gets goatpox. It's important to note here that there are two separate ECCNs. One applies to the goatpox virus itself, and a separate ECCN applies to the goatpox vaccine. And they each have different associated controls. The goatpox virus, so if you have a test tube or a culture with the goatpox virus on it, that is subject to CB column 1 controls. That requires an export license to ship that test tube to almost any country in the world. Interestingly enough, if you can't afford a test tube and if you intentionally infect a goat with the goatpox virus, that infected goat also requires an export license. If you happen to be accidentally, unknowingly exporting a goat and you don't know your goat has goatpox, that's okay. but when you intentionally infect an animal with one of these diseases for the purpose of transporting the disease across borders, then that's when you need a license. So as I said, the goatpox virus itself, you require a license to ship it to almost every country in the world. You compare that with the goatpox vaccine, which is also controlled, but it's only subject to CB column 3 and AT column 1 controls. That means out of all the countries in the world, there's only about 35 in total where you need a license to ship them the goatpox vaccine. If it's not on one of those 35 countries, then you can ship the goatpox vaccine out without a license. Unlike horses, goatpox virus and goatpox vaccine are subject to associated technology controls. Those controls are found in category ECCN 1E001, and that only covers technology for the development or the production of either the goatpox virus or the goatpox vaccine. Those controls will restrict export to almost every country in the world. So if you have foreign faculty or students and you have technical data that would help them to either develop or produce this goatpox virus or the goatpox vaccine, that will require a license. Conversely, this category ECCN 1E001 does not control use technology. So if it's technology that would teach someone how to use the goatpox vaccine, that doesn't require a license. That means if you have foreign faculty or students at your veterinary college and you want to teach them how to vaccinate a goat, you can do so. That does not require an export license to share that knowledge with them. Now, the last example, and bear with me here, is a superconductive electromagnet. I'm much more comfortable talking about sick goats than I am talking about electromagnets, but I picked this here because this item also comes with use technology restrictions. First of all, to even fall into this category, your electromagnet has to meet some very specific performance standards, one of which is it has to be capable of fully charging or discharging in less than a second, and then there's also a bunch of very specific qualifications. But if, assuming for the sake of analysis, you have one of these electromagnets on your campus, it's important to know that this category ECCN 3E201 in the very bottom bullet point imposes use technology controls. That means if you have foreign faculty or students and you give them anything that would help them figure out how to even use one of these very controlled electromagnets, that requires an export license. So that's an example of the most highly regulated type of technology that you might have on your campus. Another thing to be aware of coming down the pipeline is the Export Control Reform Act of 2018. That requires the Commerce Department to conduct an interagency review and basically update the Commerce Control List under all these EAR export controls. Commerce Department put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking back in November of last year, asking for comments, and they've identified 14 different emerging technologies which could potentially be added to the Commerce Control List here in the future. On this list, it includes biotechnology, artificial intelligence. Another item here is in this middle column at the very bottom, additive manufacturing, also known as 3D printing. These are areas where Commerce Department has indicated it's likely to add items or different types of technology to the Commerce Control List. So if your institution handles a lot of technology in that area, that's something to be following and to be aware of. As of right now, nothing is final with these new and emerging technologies. BIS has also been unclear on what their intended timeline is for these revisions. They have indicated that they're likely going to put out a second advance notice of proposed rulemaking that would cover foundational technologies important to U.S. national security, so should also be on the lookout for that. The key point is we don't know what all these new controls are going to be, but we do know that they are on their way. So you'll want to be prepared when those announcements come out, that you might be very comfortable that your university isn't dealing with anything that's currently on the ECCN list, but you should be aware that that list is going to change. Then the EAR also imposes certain technology restrictions that apply to entire organizations. That's called the entity list. What that means is if you are working with a customer, or in your case, a collaborating university in a foreign country, and they're on this entity list, that's going to prohibit you from exporting most U.S. technology to that university or from sharing most U.S. technology with that university. If you have these foreign collaboration partners, you should screen them against these lists carefully. I have a picture here from one of these universities, Beihong University in China. It was added to the entity list on December 17th, 2010. It's also known as BUAA. I think that stands for Beijing University of Aerospace and Aeronautics. But of course, that's a loose English translation of what their actual name is. So the EAR creates exceptions that are very similar to the ITAR exceptions. One of these is published information. If this is information that truly is published and there's no restrictions on its dissemination, then it qualifies for the published exception. But if it's the kind of thing that is not available to the general public, if it's not in your general library on campus, if you need a key or some sort of access, or some key or some sort of authorization to access this information, it doesn't qualify for this exception. Also, information released via catalog course. If this stuff is just so basic that you teach it to students in a catalog course, or if it's freely available at an associated teaching laboratory, it's exempt from the EAR. I have a picture here of Rodney Dangerfield in Back to School. That brings us to my final poll question. What is the name of Rodney Dangerfield's character in the 1986 comedy classic Back to School? Is it Montgomery Monty Brewster, Dr. Egon Spangler, Thornton Mellon, or if you don't know and you just want to let us know that you're still participating in the webinar and looking to receive your CLE credit, just please click the very bottom box. We'll give you about 30 seconds here. And do you know this answer?
Despite being a teenager in the 1980s, I do not know the answer to this question, Grant. I'm looking forward to learning what it is. But I am still logged in and participating in the webinar.
All right, wonderful. Well, the answer here is Thornton Mellon. Montgomery Brewster is the title character in Brewster's Millions. He was played by Richard Pryor. Egon Spangler is one of the Ghostbusters. That's a different movie. And then Thornton Mellon is the name of Rodney Dangerfield's character in Back to School. The EAR also has an exception for fundamental research. This is the type of research that you would ordinarily intend to have published. This exception, like the ITAR exception, you completely lose it if you accept any restrictions on publication. So if you're doing some sort of public-private partnership, if you're accepting private funding, if there's a government grant that imposes publication restrictions, then you're not eligible for this exception. And somehow I lost this slide, but the EAR also provides a bona fide and full-time employee exception, which mirrors the ITAR exception, except for the fact that it only looks at an employee's most recent country of citizenship when figuring out whether or not they're eligible. Like the ITAR exception, it also requires you to put that employee on written notice of their export compliance restrictions. It's not a self-executing exception. So now that we went through all those different exceptions, these are a couple of big problems, areas where the exceptions aren't compatible with the way universities will sometimes operate. One of these is, as I said, government-funded research. If you've accepted government funding and that funding comes with some restriction that either prohibits you from including foreign faculty and students or requires you to assume a certain export compliance obligation, it will all depend kind of on the facts and circumstances, and different agencies award their funding differently. But the point is, if there's a publication restriction, you won't qualify for the publication or publicly available exceptions under the ITAR and EAR. So that means when you accept this federal funding, you need to read those grants and funding awards very carefully. Second scenario is technology transfers and public-private collaborations. If your university is accepting funding from a private company, or if you're forming some sort of joint venture where your faculty and students are collaborating with people from a private company, those are going to be ineligible most of the time for these exceptions. There's going to be research restrictions. There's going to be publication restrictions on whatever research you develop, which means you won't qualify for the publication restrictions. And additionally, there's going to be individuals working for that incubator or for that collaboration joint venture, and they're not going to qualify as bona fide full-time employees, which means any sensitive technology you share with them could potentially require an export license. So if your university is engaged in these type of development collaborations, you just need to look at them very carefully and know what technology you are and are not providing to that joint venture. Another problem that comes up from time to time is you might start out doing research and think that the findings are going to be published. You think this is just not controversial, no commercial value, this is going to be done for academic purposes only, fully intend to publish your research, but then halfway through that research you have $1 million light bulb go off and you realize that there's something in that research you weren't expecting to find that has very valuable commercial application. That's a good problem to have, but if it happens, you need to immediately look at whatever foreign participants you have in that research and see, now that you're not going to be publishing the information, if you somehow triggered some sort of export licensing or export technology restriction. Again, you don't have a crystal ball, you can't see the future, but one workaround here is if you're starting some sort of research project and you think it might be adjacent to a commercial application, or if you think there's any possibility it could come up with some finding that you would not want to publish, you can go ahead and request an export license beforehand. Request that export license on the presumption that the project is going to produce commercial research that you won't want to publish. And then if you get that license, you can proceed with your research, and you're better off having it and not needing it than needing it and not having it. Put here in parentheses, the practical application is that the large percentage, the majority in fact, of export licenses that BIS issues ultimately go unused. So it's better to have that license, as I said, and not need it, than to need it and not have it. If your university is asking for one of these deemed export control licenses, there's some important strategies to keep in mind. In order to obtain one of these export licenses, both ITAR and BIS will require you to present a technology control plan. And that plan has to identify how this technology will be stored and saved. That applies both to the physical items as well as data and technology that might be put in a server or saved on a computer. You need to explain the measures that your university will take to prevent sharing of that technology with foreign recipients who are not going to be covered under the license you're requesting. And you should also establish different documentation requirements so you can verify who receives access to the items and the technology and who does not. The foreign recipients who are going to be covered under that license application, they have to be willing to share an up-to-date resume. They have to share other personal information about themselves, including the likelihood that they're going to return to their home country. When you're preparing these, you need to budget time for ITAR and BIS to review your application, and also it's likely they'll have some follow-up questions for you. You need to budget time to go through any follow-up questions and answers. And then, assuming you do eventually receive one of these licenses, you need to be aware it's going to impose some very strict terms and conditions. You can't receive the license and then assume you're good to go. You have to read those terms and conditions, and then you have to follow them very carefully. If, hypothetically, you start to review your compliance practices and do discover a previous violation, DDTC and BIS both strongly encourage you to report those historical violations through a self-disclosure process. The practical effect is that almost all self-disclosures that ITAR or BIS receive are dismissed without penalty. That will often include a warning letter. But even if this is the kind of violation that would merit penalties or some sort of enforcement action, by voluntarily self-disclosing it, you qualify yourself for the most possible available cooperative credit. What will happen sometimes is you discover one of these violations and you don't know exactly what happened. You think it was something bad, but you don't know everything that went on. In that instance, you can submit an initial notification of voluntary self-disclosure, and if you get that in, you qualify for the cooperative credit, and then you can complete your investigation, follow up, and submit a full voluntary self-disclosure. The advantage to sending in that initial notification of voluntary self-disclosure is that you get the notice in because if there's a disgruntled faculty member, a disgruntled student who wants to turn you in, and if they submit their report to DDTC or BIS before yours comes in, you won't receive that cooperative credit. Similarly, if there's a private business or organization somehow involved and they report you first before you can report yourself, you lose that cooperative credit. So the idea is if you do find something that you're concerned about, get that initial notification in as quickly as possible, then follow up with the full-blown voluntary self-disclosure. And this last point, if you have in-house counsel at your university or if you have outside counsel available to you, we strongly recommend working with them in that investigation and reporting process to make sure whatever the findings are will be protected under attorney-client privilege. Very quickly, didn't cover them a lot, but you should be aware there's also OFAC sanctions. These apply to entire countries and to different terrorists or drug lords that we've put on the specially designated nationals list. Those countries include Iran, Cuba, Syria, and North Korea. There are a lot of exceptions to these sanctions that allow you to accept students from these foreign countries and faculty from these foreign countries. And particularly when you're accepting tuition payments, you have to be aware there are some restrictions that apply there to prevent Iranian people from laundering money through the U.S. financial system. And then also educational travel is permitted, but comes with a lot of terms and conditions. Very quickly, I put together a checklist to enhance compliance. One of the big problems we see is universities have really, really good compliance programs, but the faculty and students who work with all the really sensitive data are just completely ignorant to the fact that these compliance programs exist. So just aggressively promote your program, make sure that the people at your university, particularly those who work in these high-end sciences where you're potentially going to have an export licensing requirement, are aware of your policies, procedures, your requirements. As I said before, be proactive, not reactive. Make sure any technology that you're examining is properly classified, because that classification is the first domino to fall, and if you start going down the wrong path, then you're going to ignore or not be aware of all the applicable compliance regulations. When you're working with faculty and students, make sure you're working with the most up-to-date, fully accurate information concerning their citizenship. As I said, with ITAR in particular, those citizenships stay with them under the regulations. Make sure you have visibility to any third-party cooperative agreements or any other contracts, such as a non-disclosure agreement where your university might be accepting publication restrictions. Once you accept one of those publication restrictions, you are potentially disqualifying yourself for a lot of the common academic ITAR and EAR exceptions. Same way with government funding. Be aware of any restrictions that come in a federal funding agreement. Documentation, this next box, that is key. Most of the time, DVTC and BIS will not discover any of these violations until at least 2 years after the fact. So when you're structuring your compliance program, build in a paper trail. So there's different documents, checklists, documentation events that will create a clear record of your compliance efforts. Look out for collaboration partnerships with foreign universities if it's going to involve sending prototypes. Research outside the U.S., make sure you're aware of that and are looking at those different technology exports. Look at your faculty and students, their travel plans. If they are going to be traveling overseas, make sure you know what information they're taking with them. Make sure they leave behind the stuff they can't take. In some instances, it might be necessary to give them scrubbed laptops or smartphones where you've just completely removed anything that could have a sensitive export requirement. And then finally, if you do receive these export licenses, just be very aware of their terms and conditions and comply with them very carefully. That brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm sorry I did not leave you enough time, but I am done.
Thank you, Grant. I am just going to do a really quick endnote on a related topic coming out of the Department of Education recently, swirling around this idea of foreign influence on U.S. operations. And I'm going to start with a poll question. What federal student aid regulation has the Department of Education recently unearthed in response to some of this concern? Is it R2T4 or Return to Title IV, foreign source reporting, or voter registration requirements? For those of you who do not spend your days steeped in education, those are all actual education law requirements, but one of them is the correct answer to this question. So let's see how many people are paying attention. As many of you are. Good job. The answer is foreign source reporting. It is not Return to Title IV, but those of you who answered that, thank you for answering. And this stems from an old regulation requiring that institutions who are recipients of federal financial assistance report all contracts and gifts are basically gifts. Contracts include contracts for the purchase or lease or barter of property or services, as well as any restrictions on those gifts or contracts. And they need to be reported where they, one, come from a foreign source. A foreign source is a foreign government or foreign authority, but it's also a non-U.S. citizen or national, including legal entities that are created solely under laws of a foreign country, and agents acting on behalf of the first two there. And B, where these contracts or gifts amount to $250,000 in the aggregate over the course of a calendar year. You need to report those on one of two dates. The first date following the point at which in the last 12 months you exceeded $250,000. It's either January 31st or most recently July 31st, which could be one of the reasons we're getting a lot of questions lately. They're reported via the e-app. Those of you who don't know your financial aid directors who have questions about this should ask about the e-app. It is how we report as institutions of higher education information about our status to the Department of Education. So it'll be your financial aid office that is dealing with this e-app response. It's question 71, asks for reports on these foreign contracts and gifts. And at question 69, it's sort of an any other information you want to provide space, and it may be one where, because we have no regulations implementing the statute requiring foreign source reporting, you might want to include some additional information explaining your response to the department. If you have old missing reports, the e-app is also where you file those missing reports. If you would like to know a little bit more about foreign source reporting before signing off, here's the statute. In February, the Deputy Secretary for the U.S. Department of Education, who is coincidentally a retired Brigadier General with national security background, testified before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and explained that fewer than 3% of schools are doing this reporting. Certainly many of our 5,000 institutions of higher education in the U.S. do not have foreign gifts or contracts to report, but presumably many more than 3% do. Those that reported on just over $1.3 billion of gifts and contracts with foreign sources from 105 countries, and the highest percentage of these came from China, which is, as we all know, a particular country of interest lately. About 90 Confucius Institutes are in the United States as of July 2019. A lot of those have been closing lately. 24 have closed between 2014 and 2019, mostly in the last few months. And in response to sort of the congressional outcry over this, in May, this Deputy Secretary sent letters to a number of institutions, largely academic medical centers, reminding them of their obligation to report on your foreign contracts and foreign gifts. The department, again, they haven't issued implementing regulations on this statute. They have given us two pretty bare bones dear colleague letters explaining that the statute says what the statute says in large part. There's a little more information in the Q&A version from 2004. The American Council for Education and other educational institutions have asked for more guidance, and the department has replied minimally. So we are still awaiting further guidance, but I expect we will see some movement in this area coming up soon. Specifically, one big open question is whether it's only gifts and contracts with the institution itself or related entities such as hospitals or foundations that need to be reported. We don't have a clear answer to that question. The bottom line here is this is an area of interest. Ensure that someone at your institution has ownership over compliance. Although this is often housed with the financial aid office, consider whether that is the best office to be handling this, particularly if you are a large institution that has a lot of academic medicine operations. The financial aid office may not be the best place for this to live. Consider whether this is a line item for someone in institutional leadership to be dealing with, and make sure that you are complying. So with that, thank you for submitting your questions. We very much appreciate it. I will give heartfelt thanks to Grant for giving us the real meat on this about export control. Thank you for joining our program today. We really hope the information we provided was helpful to you and to your organization. If you haven't already, please click on the survey link at the bottom of your screen to complete a short survey. We really do read through those and use that to provide quality programs in the future. As a reminder, this program has been approved for Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas continuing legal education credit, with Colorado and Wisconsin pending. A recording of this will be available and sent to you via a link with an email and your certificate of attendance in the coming days. This concludes our webinar. Thanks so much.